1. So I live in a rural place and in a heavily wooded area. I've always felt totally safe in the woods, even at night. I used to go for night walks all the time. I'm not really a skeptic. I do believe in some paranormal things, though I've never had an experience until this one. Regardless, I still always try to find the most logical explanation, and I don't often feel scared or unnerved by things. This experience, however, really freaked me out, and I've been thinking about it ever since it happened, so I thought I'd share. This was a few weeks ago. My parents had gone to bed, but I wanted to stay up late, so I settled into the living room to read. Our living room has these giant windows almost covering the entire wall. I left the blinds open and turned on one lamp and sat right by the window. My elderly dog, who has been let out already to go to the bathroom for the night, was back inside. Started pacing the house barking and wouldn't settle down. This is unlike her. She's super old and usually goes right to bed, and she knows not to bark in the house like that. We let her out again and she wanted right back in. We gave her some food, and still for about an hour she kept pacing and barking. She wasn't even barking at the windows or looking outside. She just paced up and down the halls and barked at nothing in particular. This kind of weirds me out, but I just shrugged it off, and then she finally settled down to sleep in my parents' bedroom. About 20 minutes later, I'm reading on the couch by the window with my cat when I hear an animal walking outside. I only hear it take a few steps. It sounded large, and I figured it was probably a deer. My cat jumps up and acts super interested in what's outside, pacing up and down the windowsill and peering out there. Then, after a few minutes, the screen of the window furthest from me across the room starts shaking violently, like something is shaking, banging on them really hard. Again, these windows span the whole wall. It startled me, and I looked over. I couldn't make anything out in the dark or see what was outside. And then the shaking and banging grew even more violent, and the windows next to me started shaking too. My cat freaked out and ran out of the room. At this point, I was really scared, and I did something you'll probably think is kind of silly. I closed my eyes and threw the blanket over my head and waited for it to stop. The shaking and banging lasted for several more seconds. I remember being taken aback at how much more force seemed to be behind it. I just couldn't bring myself to look. I had an awful feeling, and I think if I looked and saw something horrible, it would really traumatize me. It finally stopped, and I stayed under the blanket for 2 entire hours before I could work up the nerve to get up and go to my bedroom. The morning after I wake up, I've calmed down a lot and figured it was probably some kind of animal. I went outside to go look at that window to see if I could find cracks or something, and look at the screens. What I found made my skin crawl. There was a single long diagonal slash in the window screen of the window I was sitting right next to. If you were standing in front of where the slash is and looking inside, the slash aligns right over the spot I was sitting, no tracks. So that's creepy as fuck. And what's weird to me is that if there were an animal, why weren't there more slashes? Just one single deliberate slash is strange. There were absolutely no scratch marks or slashes anywhere else on the screens or around the windows, just that one. The other screens were just pretty loose right now. If it was a bird, I would have heard wings flapping. I feel like I would have heard animal sounds if it were any kind of animal. If it was a person, which is even scarier to me, I would think someone who would do something like this would have taken it further and probably have done more to scare me and intimidate me than just shaking some windows and slashing one and then leaving just to scare me. Besides the shaking and banging, there were absolutely no other sounds, and since we live rurally, the chance that it was a person seems more unlikely. It freaks me the fuck out, but there's nothing I can really do about it other than put up trail cams. Nothing like this has ever happened to me the entire time I've lived here. A few nights before this happened, I actually started feeling some bad vibes from the woods at night. To be honest, like I said, I'm normally very at ease with them. But I was out smoking a few nights before in my backyard, and just felt like I was being watched, and something was just making my skin crawl. And I had been avoiding going outside at night again, and then this happened. This experience really freaked me out, but there is not much I can do except put up some cameras. Thanks for listening. 2. So I'd like to start out by saying that I highly doubt that my experience there were caused by an underlying mental illness or even a carbon monoxide leak, considering I have never experienced these feelings anywhere else, and had gone through months of trying to figure out what was wrong and testing for a leak, which never led us anywhere. But with that said, I can't always be too sure. I moved into this house in July of 2016, and it was just my father and I. It was a nice 3-bedroom house in a nice, well-kept neighborhood on the outskirts of town. When I first visited the house for the viewing, it felt like a dream, and it was the only house we had seen that really stood out to us, and we eventually ended up closing on it because of how much we loved it. There were no negative feelings, no feelings of sickness, nothing. But as soon as we moved in, things started to change in ways we couldn't really understand. Doors would close on their own, lights would shut off or on after you've left a room. The unmistakable sound of someone in the garage or back porch, and just an overall sense of unease. The house always felt like it had heavy air, and that sense of ease never lifted even when I had friends over. Nothing ever seemed to help. At night, it felt like you were being watched from the corners of the room, and the only room I felt safe in at any point was my room. But I often cleansed it and burned incense frequently and kept it up ritualistically, and that seemed to help a lot with keeping that room energy-free. The first instance I can remember so vividly, that still shakes me to my core, was during the first month of living there. I had been sleeping on the couch in the living room because there was just something about my bedroom that kept me from sleeping, and the only place I felt comfortable enough to sleep had been the living room. I remember falling asleep around 10 p.m. and had a very, very strange dream from which I woke up from in another dream that still makes me horribly anxious to think about. I had woken up and slowly started to sit up. I was in my living room where I had fallen asleep, but my body felt very heavy, and it felt physically like I was laying down on my couch, but I was very much so sitting up. It was still dark out, and I started to look for my phone when a figure down by my dad's door caught my attention. It was a very tall and dark figure standing there. It was darker than the hall around it, and it felt downright aggressive, like I had done something personally to offend it. But before I could even move, it was charging at me. I felt the floor shake and heard the sound of rustling fabric and very deep labored breathing, which only stopped as I shot awake. Sitting up from the couch, nothing was out of place. The only thing that hinted something having been there was that my cat had his back hunched and was hissing towards the hallway. Luckily, it was roughly 7 a.m. and the sun started to rise, and I didn't move from my spot until the entire room was covered in the light of the sun. When my dad lost his job, when I was almost 18, and we had to sell the house, things started to stir when everything started to be moved out of the house. Due to my dad having to get a job in the city, he was going to move in with his best friend who lived not far from said city, and he was going to help me get an apartment when I turned 18, since we were likely going to sell the house after my birthday. Well, that left me alone in the house by myself after my dad moved out, only coming down on the weekends to take me into town to get food, as I couldn't drive at the time. During this time, I moved my bed into the now empty living room because my room began to feel unsafe and heavy. At this point, I was cleansing my room and house every day, but it never made it feel any better. The only place I felt I could be safe and watch over the house was in the living room, so that's where I stayed. When I would turn off the lights and go to bed, I would hear footsteps walking up and down the hall, never approaching the living room. And eventually they would stop, but not before they would start to speedwalk towards the living room and stop just a few feet shy of the living room. Sometimes I would hear knocking in the kitchen, when the cats would be laying with me and the dog would already be with my dad. There'd be a knock here and there, and then almost rhythmic for a few seconds, and then stop. Every night I experienced terrible night terrors that I couldn't wake up from, where a man with an unidentifiable face would be screaming somewhere in the house and wake me up and then would come storming into the living room. At this point, he would point at me and continue yelling before storming up to me, and as I scrambled to get away, he got on top of me and started strangling me. And as he did this, his face would distort into this terrifying face I can't even begin to describe, while the house would begin to be set ablaze. This happened every night until I moved out. Some smaller instances while I was living there. The sound of a man yelling and screaming in the garage, throwing tools around, and very loud music. And when you'd go to check out, you'd just be met with a dark, dead silent and untouched garage. It could not have been from my neighbors either. We lived in a cul-de-sac, and my neighbors were placed just far enough that you could barely see their front doors. From the street, my house and one other house were the only houses you could really see the front door while on the street. And that other house is the only one we could hear, and our neighbors were always quiet, beside when their family and friends would come over. I would constantly wake up with bruises all over my body, but they oftentimes looked like fingers and were usually 2 or 3 in the same place, and would oftentimes look in the mirror to see bruises that weren't actually there on my face, my neck, and my torso, and had people point out bruises that would be gone in 10 minutes if not seconds. I'm not sure what was there, but I don't ever want to live with it again, and I hope it's not causing the next family any problems. 3. For as long as I've known my wife, she's mentioned growing up in a haunted house. I've always assumed she was joking because she brought it up in quite a light-hearted way and never went into much detail. It was a big old house, and I figured she was talking about weird old house noises. The house belonged to her great-aunt, who raised my wife for most of her childhood. Her great-aunt recently passed away, and her great-aunt's daughter, who my wife calls her aunt, though technically she's her second cousin or something, I'll be referring to as her aunt, now owns the house. After my wife's great-aunt passed, we went to stay in the house for 4 nights to attend the funeral and spend time with my wife's family, as we live in another state. When we got there, my wife and her aunt were chatting and mentioned that they thought my wife's great-aunt might join the ghosts already haunting the house. I didn't consider that they might be serious. The first night we spent there, I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed someone standing in the corner of the room beside the door. Thinking it was my wife, I asked what she was doing. This woke up my wife, who was actually sleeping beside me. I said I thought I saw someone in the room with us, but it might just be my eyes playing tricks on me. She said the person in the corner next to the door. Yeah, don't worry about it. I almost pissed myself. I thought there was some creep in the room and my wife was too sleepy to process it. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but when my phone lit up the room, I saw there was no one there. There wasn't even a weird shape that I might have mistaken for a person. The door was closed, so it wasn't like there could have been someone there who left the room in the moments I was looking away to grab my phone. My wife told me it was common to see shadowy people in the night, but I shouldn't worry because they don't do anything. She fell back asleep right after that, but I just lay there awake the whole night, wondering what the hell had just happened. The next morning I asked my wife about it, and she said she wasn't kidding about the house being haunted. People who spend the night in the home regularly see and hear ghosts, but they have never hurt anyone or caused any problems. I remained skeptical even after the next night, which had been after the funeral, and my wife and aunt both reported they'd been visited in their dreams by my wife's great-aunt. So far in my mind, everything was weird but explainable. The figure in the room could have been a strange trick of the light. My wife and her aunt just attended the funeral of their loved one, and it made sense for them to both dream about her that night. The third night, I was kept awake for hours by the constant sound of footsteps pacing around the house. My wife also heard them, but said it was normal, and I shouldn't worry, and she fell asleep easily. A few times during the night, I got up to look around for the source of the noise. I even did a couple laps of the outside of the house, in case there was someone outside. I never saw anyone walking around. At one point, I was in the lounge room and heard footsteps in the kitchen, and called out to ask if there was anyone there. My wife's aunt opened her bedroom door and said she could hear the footsteps too, and just like my wife, she told me it was normal and there was no cause for concern. Then there was the sound of a drawer opening in the kitchen, which we both reacted to. and I went to check and found the cutlery drawer open. My wife's aunt, who'd come to the kitchen too, simply closed the drawer, commented with mild annoyance that the ghosts are always leaving things open, and went back to bed, leaving me to my existential crisis. I could not come up with a way to explain that away. We'd both heard the footsteps, both heard the drawer open at the same time, and there was no one there and no way out of the kitchen, except for past us. I tried staying on the couch to try and catch the mystery walker, and there was multiple times I heard the footsteps pass through the lounge room, but I never saw anything. Eventually I gave up and went back to bed. Nothing really happened the final night, though we woke up to several cabinets open and no one remembered leaving them open, though that could be explainable by someone just forgetting or even sleepwalking. Even so, the footsteps still bothered me, and the shadowy person from the first night and cabinets opened on the final night made me nervous in light of everything that happened on the third night. Up until now, I've always scoffed at the idea of the paranormal, but I just can't reconcile my experiences in that house by skepticism. Talking to my wife's family revealed that everyone who stayed in the house believes it's haunted, because they've had at least one completely unexplainable experience there. They all report that the ghosts leave people alone for the most part, though some who lived there for a long time as children, including my wife and her aunt, have described meeting people they thought were probably ghosts and having positive but strange interactions with them. 4. I want to preface this by saying I'm not religious, spiritual, but not religious. I believe in cleansing with sage, incense, crystals, all that. Pretty common nowadays, I know. I like to think I'm pretty in touch with the unexplained, but this has been taken to another level. So I've had sleep paralysis since I was 15. It's just something I grew used to. Other than the initial shock and fear, it didn't really bother me. When I was 19, I was living with my aunt, and I could just feel there was something in the house. That could be a whole post itself, but there was one experience that changed my perception entirely. I was working at Ulta at the time, just relevant to the story. Most of my job was just showing customers products, swatches. I normally used to get sleep paralysis when laying on my back, but this specific night before I worked, I had fallen asleep on my stomach and ended up having a really bad episode. And she, my sleep paralysis demon, was always the same woman, was sitting on my back this time, pinning my wrists down. I could paint the picture of all the details so well. This was by far the most intense, skin-crawling episode I've ever had. My wrists were throbbing. I thought I could feel her digging her fingers into my skin. I could feel her legs squeezing my ribs, and even her hair brushing my back. It was so vivid. I came to. Of course, there was no one actually in my room, but my skin was crawling. Well, I went into work next day, per usual, went through my normal day. I'd been washing my arms off from all the swatches, and my coworker pointed at this weird brown shade that wasn't coming off. I brushed it off, but when I was showering later, I tried scrubbing it off, and although it didn't hurt, it didn't budge. It was identical bruises on both wrists where she had been holding me the night before. This changed my perception of sleep paralysis entirely. It no longer felt like just bad dreams, it became very real. Moving out of that house, things seemed to halt. I hadn't had any sleep paralysis or negative spiritual experiences for about 3 years until last night. So I moved in with my boyfriend about 2 months ago. This house has never felt bad or negative to me. Same with the boyfriend, obviously, or I wouldn't be with him. Me and my now 4-month-old puppy had been doing pretty great. Brutus, the puppy, is had a couple of weird incidents, barking in an empty room, waiting in front of doors with no one inside, randomly going nuts. I figured I'd sense anything awry, so I chalked it up to him just being a crazy puppy. I saged the house, regardless, when I moved in. It's just part of my personal anointing process. I light incense pretty regularly, and things have been really good. Until last night. I get home a little after 2:30 in the morning. I wasn't super tired, and me and my boyfriend stayed up for a while talking. I decided I probably needed some sleep, so I went to bed. He fell asleep holding me in a very specific position, I fell asleep, but it was kind of like a weird half-awake, half-asleep kind of feeling. I was asleep with my eyes closed, though. It was weird because it felt like I was awake. It was so vivid. In my dream, I was looking at my boyfriend in a different position than I saw last, and right behind him was this woman. Not the same woman I used to see either. Her image shook me to my core. All of the stereotypical sleep paralysis demon features, dark hair, pale skin. The thing that freaked me out the most was his eyes. They were wide open, staring at me from behind my boyfriend's head. I couldn't see her mouth because only the top part of her head was peeking over him, but it looked like she was smiling. It took me a solid 15 seconds to force myself awake. I physically had to pry my eyes open, which is why I don't believe it was sleep paralysis, as I could move as soon as I actually woke up. When I looked and saw that my boyfriend was now in a completely different position, the one he was in my dream, I instantly felt nauseous. This did not feel right at all. As soon as I woke up, I sat up hyperventilating and crying because of how bad this energy felt. My boyfriend just trying to comfort me, telling me it's just a dream and all of that, but this was different. This felt demonic. I ended up shaking and crying in the bathroom last night, dry heaving from the image. Her face is burned so deeply in my mind I can't sleep. I'm cleansing the house again today, but something is telling me this is deeper than that. My boyfriend believes in the paranormal, and he doesn't have a problem with the way I handle things, but he's one of those, if I don't see it, it doesn't bother me kind of people. Please, any thoughts or advice would help, even if they're just going to scare me more. 5. Early 90s. My old house definitely felt weird. I'd always thought I had seen shadows in the corners, but I just shook it off as I got older. There were 2 times I remember something sounding like it had fallen, big bang and boom sound, followed by a clattering sound, only to never find anything that had fallen. It happened once when my mom and me were in the kitchen, and we went to the basement to explore what it is but find nothing. Moved in 2000, new house didn't have any weird feelings or events other than the first night. I could have sworn I saw someone move by the bedroom door. I thought it was my dad walking past, but when I got up to ask him, he was downstairs watching TV, and said he never walked by my door. I always felt it was my dad's father checking up on him. Didn't have any real experiences outside of that. A couple of times in the woods, smoking a joint. I got the noia hard and felt like either a bear was coming or we were being watched. Got in the car shortly after. Then my mom passed away in the 2010s. At the time, I wasn't religious, but a couple of weird things happened. The last words she told me were that I was a good person. Which was weird because at the time, I was always thinking about how I needed to work towards being a better person. Then she was supposed to be pretty much brain dead from a stroke, but the first day in the hospice when I arrived, she had a huge smile on her face and looked right at me as I entered. I didn't know what to think at the time, but now I feel like it was her way of saying goodbye. She never did it again, that I saw, and passed a few days later. I remember distinctly having a dream with her in it a while after. We were at our old church, and she was in the foyer chatting with someone. I noticed her sitting, talking to her friend, and I think I said, "Mom?" But all I remember is she looked right at me smiling, and I felt a bunch of positive emotions, just pure love. Later, I remember I was dealing with a woman, and she just happened to mention something about finding dimes left behind by your loved ones. What was so weird about that is since my mom has passed, I had noticed specifically dimes popping up in weird places. And when this lady told me that, it felt like it all clicked. It even happens now, and I always think of my mom and dad. After my mom passed, I was more open to everything. Since my mom was really spiritual, some things she had told me before, just general stuff, started to come true. So I knew I had underestimated her teachings. A few years after that, my dad sadly passed as well. Both were tough to let go, but I was more understanding this time than with my mom. Back then, I was very angry, but now I realized that this was just how things had to go. My dad didn't pop up for a while in my dreams, and I was worried. Then one day I had an extraordinarily vivid dream. I guess I should have mentioned that I usually don't remember my dreams, so these sticking with me means more, I suppose. Basically, in the dream, I'm in bed, and someone is coming to smother me with a pillow, and I see it coming, so I'm ready to explode when they do. As I do in the dream, I wake up. The lighting in the room is the exact same as in the dream. Fairly bright and sunny. I'm a little shaken up by the dream because I couldn't see the figure, just the pillow. My room door closed, and I hear my dog whining outside, probably to go outside. I open the door, and much to my dismay, my dog has shit everywhere on the main floor. It took me a while to put the dream and the dog pooping together, but then I realized someone woke me up, and it had to be my dad. He was always funny about waking me up when I was a kid, and he was very close with my dog. I did see my dad in later dreams, a few times with my mom, with his greyish hair, and then once looking much younger, which admittedly threw me off. I had only seen a few pics of him from the 80s, and even fewer from the 70s, but it was him for sure. I did notice my mom in my first dream encounter looked younger too. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories. Episode 265. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. If you enjoyed the video, then please do the things and the stuff. It's very helpful to me. And I have noticed that view numbers have been a little higher since I started asking you guys to do that. So it's helping, and let's keep that going. Because it's good for me, and hopefully in the long run good for you guys. Because it means more Hellfreezer. Yay! Right, let's see. Okay, this is Friday, 28th. We don't have a birthday shout-out today, because we had one yesterday, but it was for today. But it was better to do it yesterday, because yesterday's video was a better choice for that particular shout-out. Alrighty, things and stuff and whatnot. So, I think we're going to wrap things up here, because as always, I'm busy recording, and the life of a successful, semi-successful narrator. And with that, I'm gonna head off for now. So until next time, what do I usually say here? Juggle your mother, kick your father, eat a full meal before swimming. No, that's not it. Oh, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.